In 2019, the United Nations estimated that more than 700,000 people, or 1 in 100, died by suicide. It was the fourth leading cause of death among young people aged 15 to 29. While rates varied between countries, regions, and gender, their analysis showed that more than twice as many men kill themselves than women. Suicide rates are generally higher in high-income countries. The situation may be even worse today, from job loss to financial stress and social isolation. The many risk factors triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic make suicide prevention even more important today. Since suicide is not limited to non-Christians, it's important for us to talk about this global tragedy. That's why today, Vicki Hitzges, Kent Edwards, and Nathan Norman will take a sobering look at Saul's tragic death in 1 Samuel chapter 31. Welcome to CrossTalk, a Christian podcast whose goal is for us to encourage each other to not only increase our knowledge of the Bible, but to take the next step beyond information into transformation. Our goal is to bring the Bible to life, into all our lives. I'm Brian French. Today, Dr. Kent Edwards, Vicki Hitzges, and Nathan Norman continue their discussion through the book of 1 Samuel. And if you have a Bible handy, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 31 as we join their discussion.
My introduction to pastoral ministry was really a baptism by fire. Before I could graduate with my Bachelor of Theology degree, I was required during a summer to go to a local church to be mentored in ministry. It was a great idea. I applaud that initiative, but it didn't work out so well for me. The pastor who was supposed to mentor me when I arrived went on vacation. So here I am, not graduated from Bible school, suddenly placed temporarily in charge of this church. And then I got a call. There was a death. I knew enough to know that when someone dies, you've got to go and minister to them. I didn't have a clue how to do that. I hadn't taken a course in that yet, and nobody had mentored me. I remember driving over to the house, praying desperately for the Lord to return, so I wouldn't face that awful situation. I'm sure that I was just fumbling through in my best efforts to try and minister to the people. But after a period of time, while I was there in the house, the doorbell rang and in came the federal police. They asked for the woman who had lost her husband to go into another room. They wanted to talk with her. And I heard shortly after a wail, a scream that I never want to hear again. It was then that we learned that her husband hadn't just died. He'd committed suicide.
Oh, boy.
I thought death was death, but I realized in that moment that was not true. There are different depths of hurt that happen when someone passes. And I don't think there's anything more difficult for a family to have to deal with than a suicide in the family. There's nothing worse than a family member taking their own life. Nathan, Vicki, have you ever known a person who has chosen to take their life?
I have, and the gal who killed herself was a happy girl. It was shocking to me. She wasn't one who was constantly depressed that you would think. And yeah, it was surprising for everyone.
Yeah, and I had a similar story to yours, Kent. One of the first funerals I ever conducted was for a young man who had stabbed himself dozens and dozens of times.
Oh, what a terrible way to go.
Yeah, just awful situation. And I was the pastor at the church at the time and who took the phone call. So I went into the hospital and I was there with the family when they brought him in. And yeah, it was really, really difficult to see the anguish of the family and the pain as they hoped he would pull through and then their disillusionment when he wouldn't. I know one of my close friends from childhood, we kept in touch as we both kind of moved away, and then all of a sudden there was no contact, and it turns out he committed suicide.
Wow.
And I think of him often, actually. There's songs that come up. There's moments in ministry because we had ministered together in the way that our church allowed us youth to minister, and I just think of him, and yeah, it hurts.
It's interesting how long that pain lasts, isn't it? I mean, it's not uncommon, of course, for us to miss people who have passed, but there's a deep, long-lasting hurt that follows suicide. What causes that? I mean, what causes people to decide that their best option is to take their own life?
Let me preface this by saying I am not a psychologist, but
Sure.
just in my observations, and I've certainly counseled numerous families who have experienced suicide in their lives. And my observation, for whatever it's worth, is that in all of the cases, there was this sense of being overwhelmed by something or some things. Usually the cases are all different. Finances, abuse, relationship problems, too much work, too little work, nowhere to live, loneliness, or even in one case, feeling pulled too many directions by too many people. But in all those cases, just in those conversations, it seems like they just felt utterly overwhelmed by life, whatever those situations were. There was absolutely no way out. There was too much.
Some of the articles I have read on the subject talk about things like domestic or sexual or physical abuse causing people to go to the edge of despair, bereavement, the end of a relationship like a marriage, long-term physical pain or illness, money problems, loneliness, addiction or substance abuse. Any of those things, and many more, I'm sure, could make us feel absolutely overwhelmed. And that the best thing we can do is to take our own life and just escape. But when you've seen people commit suicide, what has been the consequences on others of that suicide?
Oh, I think there's a feeling of, could I have stopped it? Was I the cause? Should I have handled this differently? Could I have handled it differently? I think there's just always nagging questions.
Yeah,
and they never go away. Right.
Yeah, there's no resolution. And, should I have made a phone call at this point? Should I have sent a text? Yeah, I know for me, there are certain songs that I used to love that I can't listen to anymore because they were introduced to me by individuals who've taken their own lives.
Yeah. In that incident that I described back in my earliest ministries, the family had a young boy. And while I was trying to minister to the family, I decided to spend some time with him, and we went out the backyard and were throwing a ball around and trying to do something just to alleviate the pain he was feeling at that moment. But when he heard his father had taken his own life, I could just see the sense of abandonment on his face. Why would my dad leave me? Why wouldn't my dad want to be my dad? I think today, when I wonder if that young boy now, a man, I wonder how that hurt him. I wonder how that shaped his life. It's interesting in 1 Samuel 31, when we see the end of Saul's tragic choices come to fruition. I wonder, why did Saul take his life? What were his triggers? I think we get unusual insight into Saul and perhaps his motivation when we read the text. In verse 1, for example, look at what it says.
It said, now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. So here he is, he's their leader, and they were losing left and right. A lot of them died, a lot of them ran away.
And what was the issue that had really plagued Saul throughout his life? The reason that led to his deliberate sin against God, that disqualified him from ministry. Do you remember what that common motivation was for him?
Pride and glory.
Yeah. He was so concerned about his self-image. When the men were impatient that Samuel hadn't come to give the offering, they got ready to leave. And so that's why he offered the illegal sacrifice. When when he was told to kill all the Amalekites, and he didn't because, he wanted to give the benefit of their battle to those men. He cared about their influence, their perspective of him more than anything else. And now here he is losing badly. His reputation is being destroyed. The battle is not going as he wanted it to go. And he is the king who was chosen by the people to lead them into battle, and now he is utter failing. I wonder if this wasn't a blow to his self-image that was difficult for him to bear. And then in verse 2, it gets worse, because we read,
it says the Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua.
The loss of a son or daughter would be awful. I've not faced that, but I know when my parents lost a son, it absolutely devastated them. And there all of his sons are executed. They're killed on the battlefield. I can't imagine the loss, the pain. Think of all that Jonathan had done for him.
Oh, yeah, Jonathan, yeah.
Even though Saul didn't always appreciate it, Jonathan had faith like David. He led the people into battle and won some tremendous victories. And he was gone, realizing that he had no heirs, that he had lost his 3 most precious people in his life. I wonder if that wasn't a cascading cause of his frustration, of his desperation. And in verse 3,
it said the fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. I'm not an archer, but I've seen archers, and I think about going to summer camp and pulling back that bow and having that thing pop into the big hay bale. You have an arrow come into you, and I mean, whap, into you. Imagine how that would hurt. It's designed to kill. And if you're wounded critically from an arrow into your skin, man, and you're already down, and you feel like a failure. You've lost 3 people who you love deeply, your sons, the most stressful thing you can have happen, and then to be wounded critically, whew, that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And keep in mind that in ancient battle strategy, the archers were kind of like artillery are today. As we record this, there's a terrible war going on between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and we keep hearing about the role of artillery in this battle. When artillery can affect an enemy, it means that they're close enough. They're coming close. It means that his army is defeated. They're moving towards him. And now he's wounded. How many times are we tempted when we know that death is soon to hasten that? I'm going to die anyway. Why deal with the pain? And Saul realizes that his life is going to quickly end. And he doesn't want to use his last moments any other way. He just wants to escape. And so in verse 4, he reveals his hand, and he makes a comment to his armor bearer that is very telling, isn't it?
Boy, I wonder what that guy thought. Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me."
So from his own lips, the rest we can surmise, and I think it's legitimate, but from his own lips, what are his reasons? Why does he want to die?
He's an absolute failure because his whole army has died. His family has died. and he is overcome with grief. He is physically injured, critically, which probably means, he's probably going to be crippled. Maybe it went through a hand, maybe it went through a foot or the side, but he's going to be crippled for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And he fears the future. These people will get me and abuse me.
Yeah. He doesn't want his body to be abused. No, he doesn't want to be abused. It's fascinating to me. He asked his armor bearer to kill him. He would prefer to have his armor bearer sin rather than him commit the sin of taking his own life. Reminds me a bit of Jonah, right? Where Jonah says to the sailors, throw me overboard and the storm will stop and you will be saved, when he could have just jumped.
Oh, that's interesting.
But the armor bearer refuses.
Right.
He is more righteous. And so that we read in verse 4 and following that Saul took his own sword and fell on it. What were the results? What did Saul accomplish by taking his own life? What effect did that have on family?
Well, it says Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. Wow. Sin is contaminating.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that awful, rather?
Yeah, and there have been study after study that show that there are something called suicide clusters. When there's one suicide, there's a larger percentage of a chance that someone else will commit suicide. And then when there's 2 or 3 suicides, there is a massive, massive chance that there'll be more in a community. In fact, the community I minister in went through that a couple of years ago, just before COVID. We had a series of young people committing suicide, and it just it was utterly gut-wrenching. And this phenomenon just happens when it happens to one. The likelihood of it happening again and again is exponentially larger.
And keep in mind, the armor bearer would have been the closest confidant of Saul.
Right.
They would have gone through all kinds of battles together. Their relationship would have been strong. And when he saw Saul take his life, it's a cluster. He takes it. And the whole family was destroyed. What was the impact of his suicide on his community? In verse 7.
What was it, Nathan?
When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. And the Philistines came and occupied them.
Devastating effect.
Right.
If he's gone and he sees no reason to live, that all hope is gone, then all hope was gone in them.
Right. It
And that had a devastating impact.
crumbled the community, crumbled it all.
And what about the effect that Saul's suicide had on himself?
The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Beth Shan.
Oh. Do you remember what he said? Why he wanted to die?
He didn't want to be abused.
And what happened after he committed suicide?
Oh, they just decimate his body.
Talk about abuse. Talk about the shame. Talk about the degradation when they treated his body. And the fact that he went and he was put in the temple of the Philistine gods, what does that mean?
Our God's stronger.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the leader of Yahweh's people, and we hacked him to pieces, and our God is greater. It not only ruined Saul's life, it smeared God's reputation internationally. This has to be one of the most depressing chapters in the whole Bible. I just see that the full impact of the weight of Saul's decisions to sin over years, all coming to bear. It's almost too much to bear. But the worst comes next. In that somewhat opaque ending paragraph of this chapter, Vicki, would you read it for us?
Sure. It says, when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. I'm not sure I understand all that.
Oh, it's somewhat opaque. Nathan, do you have any insight into this?
Yeah, the key to it is Jabesh Gilead. We had talked about it earlier. It was in 1 Samuel 11. This was Saul's greatest moment as a king. And this was when God was on his side. The people of Jabesh Gilead were besieged by a foreign invader, and they called out for help. And at that point, the 12 tribes of Israel were largely just kind of warring tribes and factions. They weren't unified. They didn't really listen to anyone, even though God had anointed Saul king. Saul called upon the Lord empowered him, and Saul rallied all of Israel to go and rescue the people of Jabesh Gilead.
That was pretty amazing.
It was incredible. It was only the work of God working through this man that they were able to save the people of Jabesh Gilead. And so they rescued these people of Jabesh Gilead, and that's why the men of Jabesh Gilead have so much regard for Saul. He literally saved their lives.
And Jabesh Gilead was from his own tribe, right?
Yeah, they were Benjamites.
Right, the same as Saul.
They're his family.
Right. And when they heard what happened to their family member who they revered, they traveled all night. Think of the danger they had. They weren't just on the battlefield. They went deep into enemy territory. I mean, this is something out of the newspaper today. You'd expect the Mossad to do something like that, go in deep undercover at great risk in order to save someone. And they went to save Saul's reputation. They wanted to give him honor. And they risked their life by going right into the heart of Philistine territory, into the temple of the Philistine god, taking his body back, making sure no one could abuse it anymore, and burying it where they couldn't find it, so that his reputation would not continue to be disowned. So here's my question. If these brave members of Saul's family were willing to risk their lives to do all this, would they not have had the courage and willingness to come earlier and save his life?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think so.
They risked their lives to save his body.
Right.
How much more if he had been captured would they have gone in after him?
But Saul was so depressed, was so overwhelmed by the circumstances that he created for himself, that he lost sight of his own family. The tragedy of this is that I think his death was unnecessary. No, he could not stay as king. No, he could not undo the consequences of his constant choices to sin. But I think he had family that was there to save his life if he had only asked. And he didn't. So what does this passage say to everyone today who thinks that things are so hopeless, that death is the better option? Man, if he had family, we have family, right?
No, absolutely.
I mean, as Christians, of all the word pictures and metaphors used to describe the church, one stands out above the rest, and that's family. Yeah. In fact, it's so much of the essence of the church that it cannot even really be called a metaphor. Metaphors describe what the church is like or similar to. It's called a light, a flock, a field, or building. But family is not metaphorical. Family is a literal description of the church. That's why Paul says in Ephesians 2:14, you are no longer foreigners and strangers. But what does he say instead? You are?
Fellow citizens with God's people and also the members of his household.
Fellow citizen and members of his household. The church is not like a family. It is family. God is literally our Father. Jesus is literally our elder brother, and we are literally brothers and sisters in Christ. When we come to the end of our rope and we think there is no hope, don't be like Saul, who thought he was alone, because you have brothers and sisters in Christ who love you, care for you, and want to rescue you before it's too late. Family helps family. And I guess what this passage says to me, and I hope says to all who are listening, is that if you're a Christian, if God is your Father, you are never in a truly hopeless situation. When everything looks bleak, call on the family of God. There are people who love you, and the family of God will come to your rescue. If only you reach out. If only you ask.
Why is it suicide is so tragic? Because it is unnecessary. Your Christian brothers and sisters will come to help you if you ask. I trust that today's discussion of God's Word has been helpful and served as an encouragement to not just be hearers of the Word, but doers. Together, let's bring God's Word to life, to our lives this week. The CrossTalk podcast is a production of CrossTalk Global, equipping biblical communicators so every culture hears God's voice. To find out more about this educational nonprofit organization, please visit www.crosstalkglobal.org. You can also support this show by rating it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're enjoying it. Be sure to listen next Friday as we begin a new book of the Bible. You won't want to miss it.